Good evening, everyone. We are now in chapter 3, and we ended chapter 2 yesterday. And I think it's important for us to take stock of the few years of narratives that we had gone through in chapter 2, from the time of uh, David's death. And so let me just draw on the right side. If we have David's death, right? The death of David right here. It's a starting point. This is now in verse 1. This is chapter 3, verse 1. And this is in chapter 2. And so we have 1, 2, well, I guess 1, 2, 3, 4 years thereabouts. And right after the death of David, we read in chapter 2 yesterday that Adoniah was dealt with, and then Aviatar was taken care and arranged for him to be away and no longer a priest. Next, we have Joab, and Joab was also killed. Now, the next one was Shimei. Shimei was given a privy that he wasn't killed until the end of the 3rd year. And so we have here the fact that he was given a reprieve for the good things he had said about David. And Solomon, in his wisdom, gave him an arrangement of a city of refuge of sorts to stay in Jerusalem and not leave the place. And eventually he did. And so he was killed as well. We come to chapter 3, verse 1, and it says here, and Solomon formed a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her to the city of David. Now, this is right here. This would be alliance with Pharaoh. Now, one of the things I wanted to highlight to us by understanding this is that this formed a marriage alliance. Literally, Solomon married Pharaoh's daughter and made himself the son-in-law of Pharaoh. That's what it means here. And in so doing, it is actually what is normally called an alliance. That's why they call it an alliance, and that's correct. It is an alliance. The alliance means that there is a peace treaty, an arrangement of sort, such that the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Egypt will be at peace. And by this marriage seals the peace treaty. And so this is what chapter 3, verse 1 means. And after that, he would bring her into the city. Now we read these other words. Until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. Now what we see is that the alliance with Pharaoh would have taken place sometime after the 3rd year, right here. Let me just put it down. Sometime after the 3rd year, but we don't know exactly how long thereafter. We know for a fact that right here at the death of David, that was the time where Solomon would have started to reign. And so it was not until his own palace was built, the temple of God was built, and the wall around Jerusalem was built, that he built a house for the Pharaoh's daughter. Now, this is important because right here ends our chapter 2 to be described of this period of time, of things that has happened. Because from chapter 3, verse 2 onwards, it would be talking about the things that is happening at this period. And that would be where we begin chapter 3, verse 2. Now, in chapter 3, verse 2, this is the description of what is happening between chapter 2 and chapter 3, verse 1, until the time when the temple was built. There was no temple. So understand, there is no temple at this time. And Solomon didn't go straight ahead to build a temple. And so the description here is that the people were still sacrificing in the high places. Now, the word high places is Bama. We have seen this word before in 1 Samuel. High places are at the top of hills, at the top of mountains. They are really recognized as places that you can approach God in the Near East concept. The people would offer sacrifices to God. Now, we talk about sacrifice, we always think of slaughter. They slaughter and make an offering, and this is what sacrifice actually means. And so the understanding here is that there was no temple, and people were going to high places. And I think in the old days, the high places would always be at the mountaintops or hilltops. They would build a mound. For example, if it's at the hilltop, they would actually build a mound. They will put rocks, they stack it up, and that will become the Bama. And this is where they make the offering, right? The offering to their gods. And so this is a practice even with the Israelites, with the Canaanites. And you'll find that in other cultures, when they don't have hills, they build pyramids to do the same. And so there is a sense of religious activity always happening at hilltops. You would think of this, that when people seek truth, when people seek God, they do not go down to the valley, they go to the mountaintop. And so this whole concept is a very Eastern concept. And so Bama is literally defined as places which is at the high elevation, and they would put altars there. And the reason why they go and sacrifice in high places or the Bama was that there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. Until those days was in those days, right here, there was no temple. House for the name of the Lord is the temple. The place where God will have designated. Now, this is important so that we now understand the background from chapter 3, verse 2 onwards is describing this period of time. And it is in the first few years of the reign of Solomon. Chapter 3, verse 3. It says now, and this word is really and then. And then Solomon loved the Lord. This would be Jehovah. This is a description of the character of Solomon, walking in the statutes of his father David, except that he was sacrificing and burning incense on the high places. Now, we need to break this down a little bit. When it says Solomon loved the Lord and walked in the statutes of David, his father, we are talking about this period of time, right? This period of time. Before the temple was built, right after the death of David, when Solomon started to reign, he inherited the last words of David to instruct him to walk right before God. And so when it says Solomon loved the Lord, he gave himself to God. And he was walking in the statutes of his father. He remembered the Torah. And there was a negative comment, because this word here, except, appears to be a negative comment. And the idea of except points to the fact that there was yet no temple. For everything that he has done, he has not yet built the temple. And then it says here he was making slaughters and burning incense on the high places, and that would be Bama right here. And so he would go there to do this piece of work, which is quite interesting, that when he was charged to build the house of God, he didn't do it immediately. So 3 years have passed after Shimei was killed. And then in chapter 3, verse 1 will be some time. And we're talking about close to 4 years, right? Close to 4 years. And what did verse 4 says? Verse 4 says, and then the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, because that was the great high place. Now understand this. He went to Gibeon. Now what is in Gibeon? We now need to understand that there is the tabernacle, right? The tabernacle. And the tabernacle started in the wilderness. And then it was moved and planted in Shiloh. During the time of Eli, they lost that place and it was moved to north. And then finally it came to Gibeon after they lost north. And so the tabernacle right now is in Gibeon. Right? This is Gibeon. And that is what it says. They went to Gibeon. At the same time, what they have in the tabernacle was also the altar, right? The bronze altar with the 4 horns. And that is where they actually offer sacrifices. And that is where Solomon went, that you can see. And so Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar in that one day. In that one day. Now, I want us to take a look at 2 Chronicles chapter 1. That would be a parallel passage. I wanted us to be able to compare and to contrast how the two passages will sit side by side. In 2 Chronicles chapter 1. Reading from verse 3, we are also told that the high place was at Gibeon, because the tent of meeting, which is the tabernacle which Moses made in the wilderness, was moved there. Remember, to Shiloh after that, and to North, and then to Gibeon. Then we also need to remember the ark of God from Kiriath Yearim went to Jerusalem. This is in 2 Samuel chapter 5. And chapter 6 was the moving, had pitched a tent and covered it. And this was in Jerusalem. The bronze altar, which Bezalel made, that would be in Exodus chapter 31. The son of Hur, Ben-Hur, was there before the tabernacle. So that is what I have just described earlier. We also see in verse 6 that Solomon was there before the Lord at the bronze altar, at the tent of meeting, which is the tabernacle, and offered 1,000 burnt offerings on it, which is right here. So now you can see parallel passages in this way. Now, I want us now to take a look at the next verse onwards. We are in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 5. 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 5 reads this way. When he was in Gibeon, right? That was when he made 1,000 sacrifice in the one day. Remember, this is taking place in that first 4 years of the events. It is not thereafter. We are talking about that period of time where he was walking with God, walking according to the statutes of God, and Solomon loved God. The Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night. Now, this is important for us to realize that God actually can appear to humans. And in so doing, the dream, and obviously dream is always happening at night, and this always happens, for example, with Daniel, with the prophets. But the type of dream is what I want to point out to, because he remembers exactly what was in the dream. For the details that is being said and how God would have conversed with him in that dream, yet not face to face, but in some indirect mechanism that Solomon knows that it is God. And so Jehovah appeared. Now, the word appeared is a word was seen. So Solomon saw God in the way where God allowed Solomon to see him. Now, what exactly did Solomon see? We are not really told all the details. And it is important for us to realize we do not need to make any speculations as to what exactly Solomon saw, but he knew what he saw was God, and he also heard God said. God asked him a question, and the question is this: ask what, right? Ask what? Now, the idea of ask here is an imperative, right? This is an imperative. If this was an imperative, we should be saying, ask, not would you like to ask? What would you like? That wouldn't be the Hebrew expression here. And so here it would be God telling Solomon, ask what? What? What you want? What you want me to do, to give you? And so this is really a very interesting expression, because we've never seen this kind of imperative before. And so God was here to examine the interest of Solomon. And as we have read, Solomon loved God, gave himself to God, and walked in the statutes of David, his father. And so God says, ask. Just ask anything. Ask what you want me to give you. Now, this word give literally means to uh, to bestow, right? To bestow or make happen. It is an open check, actually, if you want to see it that way. And in the parallel passage, you see that in that night, God appeared to Solomon and said to him, ask what I shall give you. And this would be a better expression of the statement. As you can see, these words are inserted by the translator. Ask what me to give you. So ask what I shall give you would be a good way of expressing. God is giving him an imperative. Just ask. So that in itself shows us how God is viewing Solomon, right? How he is viewing Solomon. Now, in the next verse is what I want us to pay attention to. Verse 6. And then, after God says, ask, and then Solomon said this. Observe what Solomon says. He says, you have shown great faithfulness to your servant David, my father, according as he walked before you in truth, righteousness, and uprightness of heart toward you. And you have reserved for him this great faithfulness, that you have given him a son to sit on his throne as this day. Now, I think we want to actually be clear that Solomon is now declaring the faithfulness of God. The faithfulness of God is not unidirectional. The faithfulness of God is not unconditional. The faithfulness of God is shown. Shown means can be seen. And how was that? It was according to how David walked before you in truth. In truth would be trustworthiness. David was trustworthy, and he stayed true to God. Righteousness, that would be tzedakah, that he kept the right instructions of God to treat the people well. Uprightness of heart. His heart was upright. His heart was, how should we say, an upright person means that he is a pure person. He is an honest person. In his heart means in his mind, in his decisions toward God. And if you recall, towards the end of 2 Samuel, we could see throughout that David always acknowledged God in everything that happened. And that would be uprightness of heart, the purity of heart, the honesty of his decisions. And in return, God demonstrated his faithfulness. You have reserved for him the great faithfulness. What is the faithfulness that you can see? Is that his son would sit on his throne as this day. And that would be the fulfillment of 2 Samuel chapter 7. This is also known as the Davidic covenant. Now, the Second Chronicles say it slightly differently. It says, "You have dealt with my father with great faithfulness, and you have made me king in his place. You have put me as king in place." Meaning, after David has died, you have made Solomon king. "And now, Lord God, your promise to my father is fulfilled." This is faithfulness. God said it, he will do it. "That you have made me king over a people as numerous as the dust of the earth." Now, I just wanted us to see the two, because Solomon understands God, knows God, and we're still talking about the first 4 years of his reign. Now we see something quite interesting in verse 7. He says, "Now, Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. Yet I am a little boy. I do not know how to go out or come in." And this is what we want to examine a little bit. Solomon, at this point in time, would be in his early days of reign. So the question would be, why does he call himself a little boy? This is Na'ar. You could say a young man, very young man. And he describes that he does not know, right? He does not know, right here, how to go out or come in. And this statement is really to tell us that Solomon is not old. Solomon became king when he was very young. And I would like us to take a look at a couple of points. The couple of points is this. We can see from 2 Samuel chapter 13 onwards, all the way to chapter, I would say, chapter 24, is a period of 12 years. 12 years. Solomon was born in 2 Samuel chapter 12. And so some people tend to say, well, if that's the case, once you cross into First Kings, Solomon would probably be just 12 years old. That's why it's said to be a little boy in that sense. However, if you just take only the period of time from chapter 13 to 24, indeed, there was a description of 12-year period. But we don't know how long that took place between chapter 12 and 13. And that is always an open statement. Now, I want us to also realize there is this piece of information that we need to consider, and that will be in 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 21. "And Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, became king when he was 41 years old." Now, what significance is this? It's very clear that Solomon actually ruled for 40 years. And then Rehoboam took over, which means that at the time of Solomon becoming king, Rehoboam was 1 year old. If that be the case, it is highly, highly unlikely that Solomon would have been 12 years old. Because I can't imagine how a 12-year-old has a son. But if you can see that there are some other Jewish commentators that says that a period has gone by between chapter 12 and 13, and by which time that he became king, he would be a young man, and this would place him to approximately 20 years old when he became king. And that would be quite acceptable, quite acceptable as a little boy or a young man, a na'ar. And he says that I do not know how to go out or come in. And that would be something reminiscent of Deuteronomy chapter 1, when the children who doesn't know good and evil are those who are 20-year-old and below. And only those who are 20-year-old and above would be the ones that would be numbered to be the army of God. And so it would be, in that sense, consistent then to think of Solomon becoming king at age 20, an age where God had considered a person to be old enough to know good and evil, and starting to be numbered as one of those to be used by God. So I would just leave this with you, so that you understand that this little boy is approximately 20-year-old. Now, why am I raising this? Is that in the last chapter, how Solomon conducted himself with Adoniah, conducted himself with Joab, and then with Abiathar, and then with Shimei. All of these, as I had tried to highlight in the last few sessions, that Solomon was indeed very wise. And so I wanted us to now understand and appreciate that his wisdom was in that period of the first 4 years. And that is now in this passage that we are reading. That God has asked him, ask what you want. And so Solomon says, your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people who are too many to be numbered or counted, people as numerous as the dust of the earth. Now you understand that we have these kinds of expression in the Hebrew as the stars in the sky, as the sand on the seashore, as the dust of the earth, which we see here. It is merely to tell us that that is an equivalent of too many to be counted. That it is so many that we can't count. It's like the stars in the sky. It's like the sand on the shore. It's like the dust on the ground. So this is a great people. Now, great people is also understood as great in number, and we can also see greatness in terms of the way they handle themselves, and the way they think and the way they behave. But at this point in time, I want us now to look at verse 9. Verse 9 and verse 10 in 2 Chronicles chapter 1. What did Solomon ask? So Solomon asked, give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. And then, of course, he says, for who is capable of judging this great people of yours? The great people, not only in terms of numbers, but also in terms of behavior. Because there will be complications with the Israelites. Now you look at 1 Chronicles chapter 1 verse 10. Now give me wisdom and knowledge, so that I may go out and come in before this people, for who can rule this great people of yours? So let's understand this. The word rule is equivalent to judge. And so understand that these are synonyms. To rule your people is to judge your people, to be able to to discern what is right and wrong, what is good and evil, what is uh, the right way to resolve things. And there are so many of them, and there will be so many cases. And so Solomon asked for an understanding heart in 1 Kings 3:9. And in 2 Chronicles 1:10 would be wisdom and knowledge. And so I want us to be very mindful that an understanding heart is the same as wisdom, as the same as knowledge. These are synonyms. Synonyms. So, what is an understanding heart in verse 9? An understanding heart is one that you can discern. You can tell the difference. You have good perception. You can have great insight. Then again, we find the word wisdom. Wisdom is also understanding, right? Understanding. It is also keen insight to be able to tell the difference in nuances of events and people. Knowledge. It is about experience. You would find that to have an understanding heart, heart of wisdom, and a heart of knowledge is very much the same thing. It is to have a keen sense that one will be able to tell the difference between good and evil. Right here, to discern good and evil, so that you can judge, so that you can rule, so that you can make decisions, so that these great people of God will be managed well. And what really did Solomon ask? Solomon asked for an insight, a special insight, so that he can do God's work, so that he can do it right before God, so that he can do it right for the people, because he recognizes that these are the people of God, many of them, and great in stature, great in engagement, and he can be very complex as well. And so he sees himself as a little boy, young, do not have much, well, older people wisdom, because he doesn't have the experience. And so God gave him that special insight to understand things, to understand issues, to understand people, to understand the environment, to understand the matters before him. And so if you go back and examine the book of Proverbs, for example, you would also find that these are synonyms as well. Understanding, wisdom, knowledge, they are all talking about the same thing. And the word of God gives that. Now, in this case, Solomon is asking that in order for him to be effective, and recognizing that he doesn't have the long-standing experience of his father, who has lived through life for many more years, have gone through terrible events under Saul, and yet Solomon tells God, why don't you give me this special insight to understand things, to discern things, to look at matters, and to see things so that he can gain experience very quickly. This was what Solomon asked. It's not about give me wisdom and then zap, wisdom goes into his head. What you have seen in chapter 2 of First Kings was how he dealt with issues that shows that in his young age, he is able to discern and give good decisions and make good judgments. And for example, like Shimei, to have a heart of compassion. Same with Aviatar. And so these are things which is very important if a king is to be a good king. And this is what pleased God. We will tackle this one last verse before we call it a day, and then we'll continue tomorrow. Verse 10 is very important. This word now is and then. I want us to understand that this is a continuation of verse 9. After verse 9 has been said, that was what Solomon asked of God, making that request. God, give me that keen insight of understanding, wisdom, and knowledge. And so this was pleasing in the sight of the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. The word pleasing is good. This is tov. In God's eyes, right? In God's eyes, this davar, this matter is good. So understand that good right here is always in the eyes of the beholder, in the eyes of God. God is looking at Solomon and God sees this as good. And this is important. It doesn't matter who else thinks is good, but God sees as good because God gave him a blank check to write. And he had asked this thing of wisdom or understanding or knowledge or experience. This in itself shows us how the Hebrew culture works. That what is good is always seen in the eyes of the beholder. What can be good must be effected. So it cannot be in the heart of Solomon that he kept it inside of him. It has to be expressed. And so Solomon expressed it in those ways and in those words. And in that expression demonstrated Solomon's heart. And that's why the earlier verses says Solomon loved God. And in this case, he gave himself to the cause of God for the people of God that God has chosen. And so in verse 10 gives us a very, very good conclusion of how God is absolutely happy because of the way that Solomon had conducted himself. And so I just want us to be very clear that in the Hebrew culture, all things can be seen, can be heard. And once it's heard and once it's seen in the eyes of the beholder, then the beholder will respond and react. And the way that God reacted was to treat this matter as very pleasing, very tov, very good in the eyes of God. And that in itself will tell us the favor that will come, the grace that will come to Solomon hereafter. And we will leave that for tomorrow. And with this, we come to the end of our session today.